The first panelist for the day is Angad Singh, and he is a passionate journalist from Wise News. He has work experience from companies like CNN. He started his career as a video development intern, an editorial intern there in CNN, and currently he is the producer of Wise News, which is based in Brooklyn, New York. Mr. Ankad is also an avid filmmaker and has won awards for his debut work, Roots and Wings. His interests are also vary from civil rights, social action, and economic empowerment to environment and politics, right? So a hearty welcome to Ankad. Our second panelist for the day is Kavitha Ratna. So she's the Director Advocacy at the Concerned for Working Children. She's a member of the International Advisory Group on Child Labor, Save the Children Canada, and is also a member of the Expert Group Committee on Children's Participation, set up by the Committee on the Rights of the Child and UNICEF to prepare the general comments of the CRC Committee on Article 12. So our third panelist for the day is Arathi Manay Yajaman. So she's a firm believer in be the change you want to see in the world. So Arathi Manay is an independent market researcher, engineer, and general consultant working with individuals and agencies across the globe. She's also a part-time community anchor at Urvani Foundation and consults on financial matters to private firms and NGOs. So her expertise includes research design, especially in the research methodologies, as well as she is also very keen on mobilizing the citizens to write about things they encountered in their daily lives, right? And yeah, our last panelist for the day is definitely Pallavi, right? So of course, we are talking about the narratives from India, about the community stories especially, and it is as a way for the communities to gain their voice. And as we know, India is a country where we do have multiple languages, multiple cultures, multiple religions, multiple ideologies, and people from multiple geographic backgrounds and with multiple ethnicities and multiple political backgrounds. But the question here is, are all the diversities or the diverse communities are heard and reflected in the dominant narratives from this part of the world?
So I'm quite young myself. I'm 26 years old, and I wanted to start this discussion off by just giving a little bit of a backstory as to who I am. As you might be able to tell from my accent, I am an ABCD, American born, confused Desi. My family is immigrants. They came from India. I was born here myself. And so my story, it begins in the American South. It begins when I was 5 years old and decided that I wanted to start wearing a turban. For me, that was a decision I made on my own, listening to the stories of resilience, the stories of commitment to our community, and the principles of equality and social justice. Wearing the turban, I was always taught, is a crown. It's something to uphold yourself, a standard to uphold yourself to, and a way to sort of present yourself and engage with the world. And so just to paint a picture, like what is, growing up in the American South, like I would go to Christmas parties where my friend's grandmother would, from across the room, everyone's there, yell, "Who invited Al-Qaeda into the room?" It's also a place where my neighbor would bake me pumpkin pie for my birthday. People are very friendly, but sometimes they're quite narrow-minded. And I think the importance of media literacy is giving people the resources to understand stories for themselves. So how is media literacy a way for communities to gain voice? I think one of the things I've discovered through my job and through being a journalist is this idea of both sides, right? We often say a fair story gives both sides an equal voice, but it's not about equality in storytelling, and it's not about giving both sides voice just for the sake of appearing to be inclusive. It's about equity, right? Because especially as a journalist, what we do is it's reporting as a pillar of democracy. It's reporting as uplifting underprivileged voices. It's reporting as making sure those that are marginalized by power structures, that they have a voice. And so, both sides of an argument are not necessarily, they should not necessarily be weighted equally in your report, but it doesn't mean that you should, totally ignore one or the other. I think basically what a journalist and a storyteller does is you give weight, you negotiate how you present both sides of a story in the narrative that you are giving arc to, that you are giving guidance to, that you are writing, that you are crafting. Even if it's other people's voices that you're bringing forward, you have a responsibility to include voices, but as the storyteller, you're the one that gives the arc. And giving that arc, deciding what that is fundamentally your spin on an angle of a story. And I think to sort of wrap this idea of gaining a voice, if you see your job in the media as bringing forth marginalized voices, speaking for those who may not be given the space to speak for themselves by the institutions, by the power structures that exist in society today, you have to take care to contextualize those narratives properly, because if not, you risk perpetuating the propaganda that is put out by the status quo. And I say propaganda because I think, at the end of the day, everybody kind of has their perspective, but it's up to you to, with responsibility and with care, negotiate, again, what it is you decide to put forward and prioritize in your storytelling. But, as international media, my job is not always to tell the story with the same level of nuance or specificity that might matter for an Indian audience. But my job is to bring the stories that are important and happening in India to a Western audience, to be that bridge between two worlds that are really like spinning around each other in this very interesting way, especially when it comes to America and the United States.
I'd like to start actually with a quote from one of my favorite authors. And why, for me, this is a very important quote is so often history is presented in a certain perspective, which may or may not be the truth. And it's so important for all of us to wear different lenses to be able to examine this truth. One very common example we have from India is how the 1857 first Battle of Independence of India in the British history records is called the Sepoy Mutiny. So what for one culture is a war of independence becomes a mutiny in the eyes of another. So it becomes very important to look at who is writing this history. This is one of our favorite quotes, which we use when we work with our young people, that until lions have their own historians, history will be written by the hunters. It was 1980s. I think many of you weren't even born at that time, when working children in India actually said that we are working children, we are also workers. Why is it that our rights are not respected as workers? My senior colleagues who were trade unionists were interacting with adult trade workers. And when they would invariably see young children sitting with their lunch boxes, workers, saying, what about us? What about us? What about our rights? And when they were told, you see, according to the law in the country, child labor should not exist. But they said, we exist. But the law doesn't even take note of you. then they actually said that we should change the law. What was extraordinary was it was logical. If a law was unjust, it needs to be changed. But for adults, changing a law is such a daunting task. We wouldn't even want to go there. But for young people, it was very straightforward. And the entire work of my organization started in the 80s, looking at what kind of law would young people want. And what they wanted was very interesting. They were seeing it from the point they were positioned in. They were looking at the poverties. They were looking at the struggles, and they wanted to change. But they also wanted respect for the work that they were doing. They also saw it as dignity. And they saw themselves as supportive of their families. And it was very important not to be criminalized. And the whole discussion my founding members and children had, in a way, became the foundation stone of all the work that we have done in the 4 decades which followed. And what medium did children use? Since we are talking of media literacy, what did they use? The work they did generated a lot of interest. They were invited to actually come to a labor ministers meeting. Mind you, I'm talking of 1985, to present their case. And children said, we don't know these ministers. We don't know how to talk to ministers. We have never done this before. So what can we do? So they said, would you like to do a play? And that's what they did. They put up a play talking of how they experienced their reality. And the play had such tremendous impact that a decision was taken in the National Labor Ministers meeting that they would revisit the child labor law of the country. And you see the headband that the young children are wearing. It's called the Hanepatti, which is what they all wear because that unifies them. That also is a means of communication that gives you an identity, that wherever you are, you know that you are from Bhima Sangha, the Union of Working Children. And what have they used subsequently? They have looked at Wall magazine. This is the Wall magazine, which has stories, which has articles from them, which are their views. And I'm talking of working children. And you also see in the column, two young men hugging each other, and they are from 2 different communities. And this came up when there was very severe communal tensions happening in the country. And young people have also used extraordinary methods. If you see this here, this was a lovely story. It's from 1992, where a lot of officials were refusing to respond to the issues children were raising. So they put up this play where they acted like a king and a minister. And everybody was quite gung-ho because it's interesting, let's watch it. And suddenly they said, but there are so many issues which have not been met. So where are the officials? Call them. And all these officials sitting in the audience never expected to be called on the stage. They thought they have come to watch a children's play. But they had to come up because everybody said, now let's see you come on stage. And when they came on stage, children said, why haven't you done anything with the electricity? Why haven't you done anything with the water? What are you going to do about these children who have not been able to go to school? So they were really put on a spot because they had to respond. So this was another method. And this is a method of folk culture, which children are very familiar with. They've seen others doing it, but never been used this way. But suddenly it was turned into a methodology. These young people were also in the forefront in the 90s as a part of the international movement of working children. They were also gathering together in 1996. There were young representatives from around the world, from 33 countries, who came together and met in a small village called Kundapur, where we work. And the decisions they came up with much later is now called Kundapur Declaration. You must Google it. And that's interesting. Kundapur is a small village. And the declaration of the working children's movement on what they wanted and what they said has now become part of the global history. These young children also took up issues with the ILO and said, we want to talk to the ILO. We want to challenge you. And what was very interesting was when they challenged the ILO, what they said was they were questioning so many fundamental notions that when they would sit in these meetings, the ILO and the others would talk of the parents of our children as, oh, these kids, they are asocial. They come from dysfunctional families. So kids would stand up and say, I don't come from a dysfunctional family. I come from a poor family. That doesn't make it dysfunctional. And the way you talk about working children is as if we are pests. We are not pests to be eradicated. In Karnataka, our state, the very first state in the entire country to actually respect the, at least on paper, the notion that children are not citizens of tomorrow, but citizens of today. And the work of my organization very closely linked to this, because in 2002, we said all children are citizens and the local government is answerable to children. 2002, they started in a small village in coastal Karnataka, and subsequently through our advocacy, we are able to make it applicable to every single local government in the state, which is more than 6,000. So every year, the local government has to listen to young people and respond to them in terms of what issues they're raising. And you see here, children standing with a gunny sack in the middle. That is called the problem bag, Samasya Chila in Kannada. And children walk through the village with this gunny sack, talking to others, saying, if you have a problem, put it in, write it here. We'll carry it to the local government. And one of the posters they're carrying says, if we have information, we are the boss. And what we have seen is that if you look at media persons as a part of the power centers, we don't want media to scare our young people. We would like media to understand that they have a point of view. And we would like media to acknowledge that our children are not just subjects and users of media, that they're also producers of media. And if they are producers of media, then we need to recognize that they have a right to self-determination, they have unique personhoods, and their realities are multiple, and they are citizens. And if we need to do this, we also need to be able to empower them, give them spaces, and also change the rules of the game. They should not be expected to play by the rules of the adults and the quote unquote elite, that we should learn to redesign our games so that we will understand that children don't just have to be seen, they have to be heard and respected. So with that, I'd like to end. Thank you very much.
I'm community anchor with Citizen Matters, and we are an independent news media focused on cities and citizens. When we talk of media literacy, what comes to mind? It's newspapers, magazines, radio, TV primarily. Over the last few years, we've had internet and social media that is dominating our source of news. Now, in the media, there are multiple narratives, and these are led by multiple agendas, social, political, religious, and so on. Now, what media literacy really does is it helps people to go beyond the narratives, to make sense of what the backstory is and get a balanced view of the news being put out. As with any media house, Citizen Matters has professional journalists, but we also focus deeply on citizen journalism. Now, what is citizen journalism? I'd like to narrate a couple of stories that I've been involved with. You know, many years ago, I lived in Bangalore, and there is this document called Khata, which is required for every house to have. And it's quite a laborious process to get a Khata. And there is often a lot of under the hand exchange that takes place. It's such that, it involves a lot of interaction with the government, and most people are always wary when they need to go to a government office for anything. Now, this was actually one of the first times I wrote about it, and the way we handled it was we just follow the rules. What are the rules? How long does it take? What are the documents required? And we did everything as per what the rules require. If you're following the rules, then it's difficult for anybody to come in your way. So after we did this, we successfully got our khatas. We wrote about it, and subsequently there are hundreds and hundreds of people in Bangalore who were able to do it on their own. Now, these are the kinds of stories which are very difficult to convey using mainstream media, but they are so impactful for a city. Citizen journalism gives citizens an opportunity to ensure better overall governance, because when people in authority know that the local people are involved, they are watching and they're keeping a lookout, they also become more responsive. Documenting these things for future is very important, because people should not have to be reinventing the wheel each time an issue comes up. Now, citizen journalism doesn't mean that you just write anything and it's just a social media rant. It needs to be monitored, and that's where the professional journalists come in. Now, professional journalists have the skill and the expertise and the training that they've gone through, and they have access to records, so it makes it easier for them to compile and write and analyze. So it's a very complementary role that citizen journalists and professional journalists play together. What is important here is that the right to communicate is very important for people, and it's media like Citizen Matters and other news media which are interested in reaching out these community stories to other people, which make a huge difference in ensuring that people are given that right to communicate.
Hello, everyone. What I'm going to speak about today are sort of very, very rough ideas, and I'm going to stress on the very, about an avenue of research around the foundations of media literacy that I've been thinking about has become extremely important, but has not really been fleshed out about when we think about media literacy projects and initiatives. News reception studies is actually very critical to what we understand of media literacy, because the assumption is if you're going to have an initiative that aims to improve a community's media literacy, you're looking at trying to understand where that community is first coming from, right? And what media literacy can then do for that community, because media literacy is, the common understanding is that it's the ability of media audiences to be critically engaged consumers of the news, to be able to discriminate between facts and opinion. And these days I'll also add fiction to that category. Fiction, fabrication, fantasy are all categories in the news, I would argue. So audiences should be able to decipher the overt as well as hidden meanings of media messages, and they should understand that platforms have certain audiences, that each message has a certain intention, and that they can actually gauge and sort of unpack what each of these messages or intended audiences is. And one of the foundational premises of media literacy is the assumption that the audience is either unaware or not fully aware of how factual news messages are, right? So you receive a piece of information through the news and you want to verify whether or not that is actually factual. So a lot of media literacy workshops are then constructed in a way to develop, and this is a definition for media literacy that I think Kailash provided in his pre-conference talk yesterday, which I was happy to catch, which is that media literacy is the critical ability to access, analyze, evaluate, create, and act upon all forms of communication. This is an article published in the American publication Current Affairs, and Nathan J. Robinson has a great article called, the truth is paywalled, but the lies are free. So we know, for instance, here that good news or good journalism, right, often is behind a paywall, because that is the dominant sort of revenue model available for news organizations, whereas large commercial media houses that don't require public subscriptions and don't survive off of them can often circulate their content for free. And their content is often lies, right? Which is one of the arguments that a lot of political economy scholars, let me see, can still hold it, yes, can make. So that is one aspect of this, and it's undoubtedly true. But the aspect I'm more interested in is what kind of relationship do people have to the news, right? The people that we want to intervene with media literacy workshops. My hypothesis is that for a lot of people, their interest in the news is not as the news, right? But in the news as a sort of libidinal and affective narrative, right? What does this mean? And these are sort of academic ways of thinking about, how people are relating to the news. But the simple answer is that people are much more invested in how news makes them feel, right? News is much less about being informed so much as it is about narratives of desire and aspiration. They want to be heard in specific ways. And here I'm referring to the very dominant sort of mass media audience, if you will, that there is something called affect, right, of the news, which is a subjective connection they're making between the factual event that the news is reporting and the ideas, values, and objects of a dominant culture that are influencing it. So this is what Sara Ahmed, for instance, would call affect theory. And I'm just to give you an example, think about all the news, quote unquote, news that is circulating right now about Sushant Singh Rajput, right? And the kind of, in both English and Hindi language media, and consider how far facts are from the purview of news right there, right? How much is being constructed as a narrative, and the question, of course, about whether even Sushant Singh Rajput's death deserves this much coverage and so on. So there's a prioritization of a certain kind of news and a certain narrative mode for the news, which is also being centered. So my argument is that instead of seeing the news public as a sort of coherent category that passively receives the news, which is very often how media literacy workshops approach their work, it is important to see the news public as sort of fragmented through the historical processes, such as the inheritance of colonial institutions, modern relations of caste and class embedded in the flows of capital, ensuring gender and class interests. And I think class interests are actually very important to why people want to remain misinformed or want to, quote unquote, listen to their version of the news, right? Which is what they'll keep saying. But as news scholars, and news scholars particularly interested in good media literacy initiatives, we must understand the significance and function of journalism, right? For this fragmented news public, which I would say these days calls itself a Hindu news public. And in India, essentially, we're seeing so much more of this idea that you as a Hindu audience are consuming the news rather than simply, a sort of generalized mass media audience. And that there are Hindu interests in how the news should be reported. Arvind Rajgopal, very early on in the 1990s, had a great book that looked at the rise of Hindu nationalism. And at that point, he actually called it a Hindu counter-public. And I would contest that today because I don't think that the Hindu public is a counter-public. It's actually the public. It's the dominant public. So to sort of wrap up, media literacy projects have to contend with enormously complex ideological and affective processes in understanding much more local communities that they're intervening in, right? That there are often media literacy initiatives are highly local responses to much larger forces that we don't quite know how to counter. How do you critically engage with, say, casteist, Islamophobic or xenophobic patriarchal news, right? And particularly a patriarchal news public that is participating every day in conscious media illiteracy. I'm saying that there's actually power in media illiteracy, and vested interests are very often keeping that power in some very fairly typical hands. And when media literacy projects are framed, when we try to approach certain communities that we want to intervene in, we have to actually act in opposition to those interests. So we can't walk in assuming a neutral public or a neutral audience that is consuming the news. But media literacy's larger project of a critically engaged citizenry, I think, is supremely important. It's a battle that's right now at least feels tremendously uphill, right? And because many of us trying to counter the mass media's effects are often doing so in very highly local and communal ways, we have to think about community stories, not just as stories or a narrative or a point of view. And I say this particularly when we speak of dominant narratives, but as ways of truth seeking. And, I will put truth in quotes because we are a postmodern culture and there's always layers to that, right? So local and community media, finding ways of using local and community media in opposition to the dominant narrative is something that I think media literacy campaigns should be paying increasing attention to. And I will stop there. These are just some very rough thoughts I've had so far. So I'll be happy to answer any questions, but I don't know how much more detail I can give. But yeah, thank you very much.